Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're excited that so many of you could join us for today's Q&A event with Thomas Hübl about our brand new course called Ancestral Healing Code, a 5-month live online intensive to deepen our connection with ancestors and heal intergenerational trauma. My name is Anna Molitor, and you may recognize me as one of the hosts from the Collective Healing Conference, and I've been an assistant in Thomas's programs for many years. I'm really excited to be here today. This is one of my favorite areas of our work, and so I'm happy to see what we deepen into in the questions today. A couple of short announcements before we get started. Closed captions are available for this event. If you are joining us on Zoom, you can turn on closed captions by clicking the CC button found at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you don't see it, click More and you'll find options there. If you're finding us on YouTube, the closed captions cannot be turned off. If you are joining us in Zoom, we invite you to submit questions for Thomas at any time. If you'd like to ask a question, either written or live, please use the Q&A box to submit your questions. If you don't see the Q&A button, click More and you'll find it there. If you need technical support, please email our team at onlinecoursesupport@thomashubl.com. In just a moment, Thomas will answer questions you may have about our upcoming course, the Ancestral Healing Code, which begins on Sunday, November 17th. There's already an amazing community forming for the program. And at any time during this session, you can find out more by visiting the website ancestralhealingcode.com. And we'll put that link in the chat for you now. The Ancestral Healing Code course is a 5-month online intensive that includes 10 live sessions with Thomas and intergenerational process work with guest teachers such as Gabor Mate with his son Daniel Mate, Vanessa Andreatti and her daughter Giovanna Andreatti, and Rick Hansen with his son Forrest Hansen. We will also be joined by Serene Thin Elk and Ia Afo to further explore ancestral healing. Enrollment is open for a limited time, and the course begins on November 17th. When you register now, you'll also receive a discount. So again, you can visit the website, ancestralhealingcode.com, to explore whether this is a good fit for you. And for those of you who are new to Thomas or his work, here's a brief introduction. Thomas is a renowned teacher an international facilitator who has been leading large-scale events and courses for over 20 years on the healing of collective trauma. Thomas works within the complexity of systems and cultural change, integrating the core insights of the great wisdom traditions and mysticism with the discoveries of science, what we sometimes call the marriage of inner and outer science. He is the author of 2 books, Attuned, Practicing Interdependence to Heal Our Trauma and Our World, as well as Healing Collective Trauma, a process for integrating our intergenerational and cultural wounds. And here Thomas is with us. Welcome, Thomas.
Hello, Anna. Hello, everybody.
It's great to be here with you. We've received a lot of questions, more questions than ever before, so I'm excited that we just can dive right in. And just maybe to start, can you talk a little bit about why you are developing this course and why does ancestral healing work matter so much right now?
Yes, I mean, first of all, I'm excited about ancestral healing out of multiple reasons, because on the one hand, it's the linkage between individual therapy or individual trauma integration or individual developmental work and the collective dimension. So it gives us a larger map. Secondly, I think there is, in the West, we are lacking kind of in the process of colonizing the world. We also, in a way, hurt the indigenous and wisdom tradition knowledge of ancestral power, ancestral healing. And so I believe that there is like a kind of a renaissance of knowledge, not only knowledge intellectually, knowledge in a sensing way, that what was hurt and also what was developed, like the resources of our ancestors, because when we do ancestral work, we are not just doing we're doing deep, dark trauma work. It's like, of course, there is trauma, but there is also a lot of power. I mean, imagine what our ancestors already survived and integrated to a certain extent. And that has been passed on to us, including like our amazing life force. Like we are living, we are the spirit in us, and there's the tradition of living. It has been passed on for a very long time. That's why we can all be here today. And I think it's really amazing when we contextualize the individual. The individual needs a context. And sometimes in a hyper individualized world, we hear it's me, I can do everything, it's all about me. And it is not. And I think like to feel again, we see what that me does, like when it's isolated. And we also feel what we can do when we are more interconnected. And I think the interconnectedness has a context horizontally, like between us, how we create society, and has a vertical context, which means the ancestry is the context to us. The fact how my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents experienced life, lived life, took decisions, were maybe traumatized or transgressed, has an effect on my life because I've been born into that ecosystem and I cannot ignore that ecosystem. And so what I have seen over many years, every time we look a bit deeper into ancestral healing, is like a lot of movement gets generated. Like there's a new movement that starts to arise in people, in us as individuals, in our family systems. There's healing happening. And I believe the deeper we look into the context out of which we arise or what we have been born into, it's also it releases parts in us that we cannot release through individual therapy work. And I think some thought leaders in the field of trauma work or social trauma work are more and more including the ancestral and the collective dimension because it is important and because there's energy stored that can be liberated and can be liberated for us, but also can be liberated for the next generations, no matter if we have biological children or not. The liberation is not just in the genetic lineage, which it also is, but it's also for the next generation in the collective dimension. So yeah, so there are many reasons why I'm passionate about ancestral healing, and I'm also passionate about that ancestral healing is not just a mental concept and not just another try to do an exercise thing, but it's literally opening our nervous system to see, wow, I can actually use new parts of my nervous system. Like when you have your car and you have a manual and you never read the manual, so you don't know many functions. So you're like a minimalist, you're using your car in a minimal way. But if you once read the manual, you see, wow, it has actually amazing functions. And our nervous system has amazing functions. And sometimes we don't read the manual. Maybe we don't even have the manual. So and when we open those parts of our capacity to sense, to feel, to tap into information that's stored in us, that's really lovely. And then it's cognition and intention and sensing and embodiment, all of it together makes sense. And so that's why it's also like an embodied way and a sensing way how to do ancestral healing work. And yeah, and I love it because it's so, because sometimes you think, oh, when we look at the ancestors, it's, maybe uncanny and maybe painful and dark, which some parts might be, but our ancestors, or at least some of our ancestors, really want us to heal. So we have amazing allies in our ancestry that want to partner with us. And in the moment we open ourselves up to them, we create partnerships in our ancestry that are already resourcing and bring more energy to us. So I think that's all. And of course, there's so much more to say. That's why we do a course, but that's an initial answer.
Yeah, it's great. You're already touching on so many things and questions that have come in. I just want to say that I'm so appreciating that you speak to the context that ancestral healing is actually connected to healing on so many levels, and that in a westernized context where it's also in a way a healing of the cuts and the way that we've lost the memories of how to be in deep relationship with our ancestors. And I feel like I see a lot that we don't know. It's like, well, if I'm just gonna be here and live without the burden of the past, I have to distance or disconnect or cut, or we already had that in our lineage, that distancing. And so I so appreciate how you're bringing very grounded ways of remembering again and working again with what might seem like the burden, so that the life force and the energy and the connection and the companionship of our ancestors and our lineage can be much more here, which also touches that deep loneliness many of us feel in these contexts without a deep relationship with our ancestors. So that's very beautiful.
And it's also, just to jump in here, it's also with our ancestors, but our ancestors are our roots, and our roots often go into other countries, they go into other places, and our roots, on the one hand, can heal in this dimension, like where we come from, the lineage where we come from, and to harvest the intelligence that is maybe sometimes frozen in those pipes. It's like if you see our ancestry as a pipe system, and sometimes when the pipe system is stuck, so you need a plumber, and then you unstuck the pipes. But when the pipes are not stuck, then they feel like flow. And so there's ancestral flow in the one direction, so that our healing and our integration work integrates ancestral information more in both ways. The healing goes backwards and forwards. And so it generates more flow. And the other dimension is, so the context opens up, the roots open up, and the dualism between humans and the planet. Many people say, yeah, we are on the planet. And I'm often wondering, what does that mean that we are on the planet? It's like the cup is on the table versus like we are the planet. Like there's a flow of life that goes deep into the planet. And when we feel more interconnected, we're also much more intradependent or interdependent with the biosphere. And I think we see how urgently we need to reclaim that sense. But when there are cuts in our roots, we feel more alienated. And then it leads to personal loneliness and isolation, but it also leads to a loneliness in terms of nature, that we can't feel the roots and the drumbeat of the planet when our roots are hurt. And so I think there are many, many dimensions to that kind of postmodern isolation that we often see in individuals, and the loneliness that we often see.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. I think that also really touches, for many of us have ancestry that migrated for many different kinds of reasons. And we also left land where we knew how to tend the land, and we had a specific relationship with place. And so I love that you bring in that dimension, because it's like maybe that's there in our disconnect from tending the land and the way climate change, all of that's happening is also an effect of our not knowing anymore the specific lands or how to tend. And that through this work, when we feel that, maybe it feels like a big gap or a frozen place, but through this work of attunement, we can open up so many ways of, like you say, of reconnecting through that. And then that has exponential effects on how we are sitting here today with what we face. And again, like that the nourishment of the land is such a palpable and feelable energy in our lives when we do this work of reconnecting. Oh, it's beautiful.
Yeah, and it also brings in that we are living in a world where there's much more migration, and most probably in the next decades will be much more migration. There are more intercultural roots that are meeting, so that different cultural roots come together as partners and then have families. And so there is also the aspect of what it means to have multiracial and multicultural roots come together in ourselves, and what that meeting means for us as individuals, and what that meeting means for us as families, and what that means for us as global citizens. And so that's also interesting. What's the ancestral healing work between different strands of ancestry that came from different parts of the planet or different racial backgrounds? So that either creates tension, or we learn to turn that tension into creativity and integrate that tension into something new. And I think that's what we are asked to do also when we become global citizens. So that's another aspect of the ancestral healing work, obviously.
Exactly. And that brings a memory of starting to do this work in a North American context, where suddenly, and I want to ask you, because this came in too as a question, to speak to doing this work in community and what that provides. But just to share, sitting in a room and having this, when we started to really connect with our ancestry, how the whole feeling of the space changed. And especially sitting in the US context, where we don't introduce ourselves so often through those ancestries, we learned how to leave them behind to become a collective, a kind of collective. But I'm curious if you could speak to that. My own experience was so powerful, to suddenly the richness that's in the space between us, and maybe even, there's also conflicts, but there's beauty and richness and so many elements that we normally kind of disappear from the picture. And maybe you could speak to that, but also what else is in the what we receive in doing this in community together. What's the larger energy that can come in when we're not just sitting kind of on our own doing this, and even in the virtual context, we're together. So to speak to that more.
Yeah, it's first of all, I think many people who heard me speak somewhere, like I often speak about the intelligence of collectives. That healing, I believe, needs to be lifted into a collective sphere. And even in that collective sphere, we can still do individual healing, and we will do, but it's held in the collective presencing container. And I think that's also something that we maybe that is slowly coming back, is rituals, that we have healing rituals in our society that help us to create the right container that we can heal together. And I have seen so many times how large collectives, when we presence each other, generate so much more energy than when we try to do things on our own. So to be in a community of people that do that work, and they're connected through an intention to do some of the work together, and presence each other, even sometimes if you don't see each other online. Now even everybody who's listening is bringing presence and bringing attunement into the space. And that is energy. That witnessing is a power. And I often say, even witnessing is a subtle intervention. So, and a lot of the trauma and a lot of the past that is unresolved has also not been witnessed. A lot of the pain has not been witnessed and has not been confirmed. That so I see and I feel your pain. I see and I feel the transgression that happened. We are aware. We bring this into the collective space. And in the collective space, we can find ways how to alchemize and how to grow. And so I believe that anyway, I believe the future, given also the technology that is developing more and more, is gonna go into collective healing spaces. And also the data is speeding up more and more. So we will need to do healing in collectives. So I'm a big fan of the power of collective healing spaces for the individual, and the individual then through their own inner work gives something back into the collective. And so when we do it right, we are creating an upward spiral, and that upward spiral is amazing. And so yeah, I think communities are very, very powerful.
Yeah, and it's so touching when you say we can witness the pain like in our ancestry. And also, and I've seen this so many times, we witness the beauty, we witness the richness that maybe the ancestors didn't get to show up yet in our space to get, and we see that in each other. And it becomes a whole other dimension of the grace and the strength, I think, in the field.
Mm-hmm. And it's also when we sit here and at the beginning it might be even foreign to many of us that we say, oh, I don't feel much, and maybe even I don't know my ancestors. And that's okay, because we all have ancestors. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. So the fact that we all have ancestors means they're encoded in us. And so just through the intention and certain exercises, how to open our nervous system up to tap deeper into that information, we are opening a space. So, and when we tune in with the former generations, and hundreds or thousands of people do that, so it creates a much bigger container. It's not only that we are tuning in with our own ancestors, that many people do that reinforces each other. And so it actually initiates an ability in the space that is harder to learn on our own. Because if we do it together, it's getting stronger. And so we literally invite thousands of ancestors into the space, especially the ones that want to participate in the healing of all of us coming together. And so through this process, we begin to open a capacity, and that capacity then becomes like something that walks with us. And I think that's also important for everybody who works with clients and does a professional client work. It's an amazing skill, because it means once I open that part in myself, every client that comes to me is invited into a bigger space. So their ancestors are naturally invited. They feel like more home. So they will show up more and participate in the healing. And sometimes process work needs to be in the individual space, obviously, and maybe also for some time. But there is a bigger potential in the room. So there is a bigger capacity to enable healing. And that's why I think it's really like a win-win-win to do it together and to open the space deeper, and that then walks with us wherever we go. I mean, it's like a new trained muscle.
Yeah, and I just want to absolutely confirm from my experience in this work over the last years that it really does. It's like we're kind of in, like you've said before, but we're kind of slowly clearing the fog, of the generations of rupture from actually being able to feel and attune. We're in a very precise practice of attuning and learning to feel something. Maybe I don't know what I'm feeling. And then somehow more information starts to show up that really is true. And it's not just through my efforting, it's not actually through efforting, it's through this attunement together that it really starts to open. And I can say also as a practitioner with clients that this is so powerful, because often you can feel something like you might start to have a sense this didn't just start in their lifetime. You sense it and it's like came from before. And then when you start to include that in your awareness, and this field of ancestry is more open, then something that you can't really, it's not unlocking for them personally. You start to include, and like you've said before, questions might come up, like you might even ask them, like, is this something you have a sense was in the generations before you? And then suddenly it starts to come out, and they're maybe releasing, like emotion will come they didn't know they had, and something finally like it opens and it grounds. And it's very powerful and very beautiful. And I've seen that again and again. So I want to just confirm that for us. And if you're not a practitioner, that doesn't, it's also just that it's more, meaning not working with people. It's so powerful just in your own work, and also just being together in community, that we begin to sense that we aren't these isolated units. We come from somewhere. And that, yeah, like you said, it brings so much more resource and connectedness and rooting and grounding into our communities. So yeah, I just wanted to say you say that, and I've had that experience in this field, and I know many, many of us have, and that it's an ongoing process. I look forward to what will happen collectively in this course that will deepen, will continue to deepen this clearing of the fog and this deepening of connection together. So I know it's always, for me, also just going to be a new edge of discovery. So if you've been with us before, this is just an ongoing deepening process in us collectively and globally, in a way, this remembering or reconnecting these ways of sensing that are not so rational, a little bit less in the intellectual knowing of ancestry. So if you don't know your ancestors, Eileen, some other people ask questions. If I don't know my ancestors or if I'm adopted, it doesn't rely on knowing the stories, and it doesn't rely on even knowing where you came from, because it's a sensing process and many other elements that Thomas will bring in.
Yeah. And also, now that you said this, Eileen's question, for example, that I have been adopted or I don't know my ancestors, like sometimes when it feels like first there is a void, like there is like I don't feel anything. Like when we touch a part of ourselves that is more numb, it doesn't mean I can't feel. It means numbing was important. That's different, because we can frame this as an inability to do something, but we can also see it as an ability to do something. Numbing was better than not numbing. And especially when there is adoption, of course, in most of the cases, we might see that that's a traumatic event, and that traumatic event needed a certain kind of numbing, but it doesn't mean that it's not possible. It means only that that's what we need to work with. And then step by step, information can open up if the container is safe enough to allow that movement. And of course, if we do something together as a community, we create also like a safer and safer space that our nervous system feels naturally more and more open to release information as it's appropriate, to digest that information, integrate it, and turn it into soil and learning. Soil is land. Every trauma that gets integrated becomes, on the one hand, more ground, more soil, more land, and becomes more expression and learning. And so sometimes we also frame this, oh, I can't do this, which is not really true. It's not that I can't do it. It's I meet something in myself that maybe I don't understand, but that was an important intelligent function that I can get to know. And the more I make it my friend, it actually becomes my ally instead of my enemy to do something. And that reframing of what we can or cannot do is very important, I think, to learn to speak the language of human development and also ancestral development. So it's great that you brought Eileen's question, and I think that's also a question that more people had that wrote in.
Yes, and we get to participate in the collective healing of our schooling processes, that here to not know and to not sense is actually the doorway. We don't have to know. We don't have to already have it figured out. So it's a wonderful part of this as well. And we're going to go to Paul's question here. He asked, would you say, so we're talking about the Ancestral Healing Code, would you say that code is a story, unconscious or conscious, handed down across generations? And also, can you tell us a bit about the frozen, forgotten, active, and future codes, like this language of code that you're speaking about?
Yeah, it is a storyline, obviously. And when traumatized, the storyline is often fragmented. It's like when you take a newspaper article and you pull it, you tear it into pieces, and then you try to put the pieces together. Like traumatized ancestral or collective storyline or narrative is definitely part of it. And we see that often cultures, but also family systems, circle around in the unintegrated part of the storyline, the narrative. But many people think storyline or narrative is an intellectual narrative. It's the historic narrative. It's what happened to us. And that's, of course, on the one hand, that's true. But what happened to us is not only a cognitive narrative, it's an emotional narrative, it's a physical narrative, it's an ancestral narrative, it's a spiritual narrative, it's a relational narrative. So when we look at the encoded information, forgotten code is like when we look back into our ancestry, we can look back some generations maybe, but then there is a vast part of our lineage that is forgotten, that lives in us. All the functions that make it possible that we have this call here, many of those functions have been passed on for thousands and thousands of years. And then there is frozen code. This is the part of the energy stream, or energy is information in movement. So it's part of the information stream that is frozen in the past. And that's why it's missing in our life. So there are parts missing in our life, or energy streams or streams of intelligence that we can't unlock, that we can't have access to. So that's the frozen code. Then there is the energy that we use every day, that we are aware of, that is functioning in our life. And then what we pass on is to the future generations, is a certain set of possibilities that are possible the way we live. If we hurt each other a lot, and if we transgress a lot, and if we destroy the planet, so the future possibilities might become smaller. If we integrate a lot, and if we heal a lot, and if we live wisely, so the future possibilities will become bigger. So our children and the next generations will land in a bigger world that is possible for them. And so we literally have an effect forward as we have an effect backward in time. And so the time is not just linear, that there is kind of a retrocausal, like the future has an impact on us. The next generations are speaking to us, but they are speaking in subtle ways. And if we learn to listen to them, then we can use the intelligence of the future generations or the next possibilities of life. We can listen to those, and that becomes our guidance, our inner GPS steering us towards the future. And I think that makes us, not only I'm here an individual and I do what I want and I call that freedom, but it actually opens me up to a much bigger context, and that is freedom. To be living in that flow is freedom, not I do what I want. And so that bigger context, I think, is an amazing quality, that we are compositions of the information that comes from the past, the information that comes from the future, the choices we make in life, consciously or unconsciously, and how we navigate. And I think a lot of this comes back to what it means to be responsible, like able to respond, versus reactive. Reactive is reenacting the past, and responsive means I have the freedom to choose in this moment. And so the new open choices that I can make, that I can respond to a person, I can listen to a person, versus I talk to a person and I already have 5 preformed answers when I talk to that person. So that makes a difference in what we will experience together. And so responsibility and local and global responsibility, I think, are big aspects of that flow. And I think also a redefinition of how we define freedom. And yeah, so I think that is a little bit of a summary of these different aspects of the code and how we are composed out of that. We are that stream.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. And you said to be living in that flow is freedom. And that reminds me of this to speak that yeah, it's not just, this learning isn't just a toolkit, it's what you're saying. And so we become someone living in that flow and that walks with us in the world. And so it's part of what we're becoming. And yeah, it's very beautiful. And also a good segue into, I wanted to bring two questions that maybe you can speak to together. Christine is asking, what is the impact of this work when I don't have children? Who will it impact? And then Lynn also asks, and you're speaking a little bit to this, but maybe more, how can our past and future ancestors be affected by the choices we make and live in the here and now? And if not, what is the effect of this training on our present choices? Which you spoke to a bit. But...
Yeah, so it like when we speak about ourselves, of course, there's a genetic lineage. These are our own children, our physical children. At the same time, whatever we keep unintegrated means that it has not been integrated into the wholeness of who we are. It's like split off repetitive information. So when we leave this life, then that information stays in the collective field. So the next generations have to pick that up anyway. So it's not just about us personally and our biological children. It's about that, but it's bigger than that. And so when the more wise or integrated or also ethically sound our life becomes, we actually are more in touch and open to receive information from the future, information from the so-called past. What is past? Past is unintegrated information, because the integrated past is here. The integrated past has this conversation, is aware of this moment. So when some people say history is the past, I would say no. For me, history is integrated. History is this present moment, is how all of us can participate in this conversation right now, how all of us participate in democracy now, how all of us participate in what we're going to do about climate change. So integrated history is the resilience and the intelligence that life developed until this moment to be able to do what we are doing and to use the technology that we are creating together. And the past, I believe, is the information of history that has not been integrated, which means it was too traumatic, it was too split off, that it couldn't, not because our ancestors were not able to, but it was simply too overwhelming. Same, it might be that for us, some parts of our lives are too overwhelming. That's not the sign of weakness, or that's not the sign of that we can't do it. That simply sometimes things are very painful and very traumatizing. And so, but we learn more and more to apply tools or technologies or therapy methods that help us to integrate more of that and learn. So the more of the past we integrate, we learn, that affects our choices today. And I believe that when we see trauma that heals here, we always see like an energy stream that grounds itself. That's the individual dimension. And then it's almost like a domino effect that, of course, my grandmother's experience in the Second World War. And when I heal part of the after effects in me, I'm not healing her trauma, I'm healing the after effects that I carry in myself, then there is a ripple effect that illuminates the past more. It's like as if more oxygen comes and opens the past that is closed. It's like a subtle wind that comes into the past and makes it more loose, more open, that it's not like a concrete field, it becomes more open. So the ground, the permafrost in our cultures, becomes warmer and starts to melt and starts to melt. And the more it melts, the narrative of humanity can integrate itself. The split between cultures, or the racial split, or the split between parts of societies that had civil wars or had genocides, that split slowly can integrate itself so that we can have a mutual future. Otherwise, we recreate a separate future because we are unconsciously recreating that past. Even if we have good intentions, we won't be able to manifest them. They stay good ideas and very open and sometimes liberal open ideas that don't come to fruition because we can't embody them. They're more philosophy than actual way of living. And so if I want to integrate all the great intentions that I have so that I can walk my talk, the healing of the past will stop the repetition compulsion, which means, wow, we can do something to stop certain cycles of violence, of toxicity, of dishonesty, of hurt, many other cycles to really have a different future. And we all know, even if I have a good intention, when I see a pattern in my life, and sometimes I say, okay, now I won't do this anymore. And then I get triggered, and then I see, and then I say, oh, it happened again. I had again a similar argument in my relationship or a similar situation with I don't know, a family member or a coworker that kind of triggered me. So the good intention is one thing, but the unconscious process behind it is often still working. And so because of that, I think opening up the ground that is frozen to let the anesthesia slowly fade and integrate the ancestral narrative literally opens us up to have a different future, a sustainably different future. Yeah.
There's a couple of questions that came in that are very related to that I was thinking of bringing, and you've really addressed it somewhat, but maybe just specifically, so you're speaking to this, Adriana brought in a question I think is interesting in the light of this course that people are bringing lots of questions around. There's just this part that I can't get free of, and that you've spoken a lot to that, how do I deal with the burden of my ancestry? But Adriana is asking, what's the difference between, or the similarity or difference between witnessing and integrating? And I think that's an important question you're just addressing. Like, what in this course is gonna, like, when we slow it down to the way we're working, what is it that allows us to integrate? And she says, is attunement and agency the embodied distinction? And maybe if you just briefly could speak to like the real practice of this that we're going to be working with. And you're muted, Thomas.
That's beautiful. The delineation or the difference between witnessing is like, let's say there's a dark room, there's no light. And we bring in a little bit of light, we begin to see in the room what's in the room. And then that's the first step. So if there is an individual pattern, if there's an individual trauma, if there is an ancestral pattern or trauma, or there's a family pattern that gets reenacted, like things that are happening over generations again and again. So often we see the symptoms and then we say, no, but I see it. Yeah, but I see the symptom. I don't see it. I don't see what creates the symptom often. I see a symptom in myself. Somebody says something and I have a tight solar plexus, I have a tight throat, I have stress, I feel anger, I feel fear, I feel shame. These are symptoms. Because when people say, I feel my trauma, no, usually we don't feel the trauma, we feel the symptoms that the trauma creates. And so, but witnessing deeper enables us to become more aware of the process itself. But then relating and touching the agency in the pattern is the beginning of re-owning that force that before was unconscious, that turns now slowly into a conscious process. And once it's a conscious process, we become one with it. And then we can transcend it, because some people, even in the spiritual communities, say transcendence is the goal. Yeah, I can transcend, but often we don't transcend what is split off. So then we can reach states, but when life triggers us, so then it seems like, oh, the unconscious world is not a good place to be. So I need to be more and more secluded because it's hard to live in this world because it's so unconscious. So that's a good sign for the shadow in the spiritual community. And so that means integration works through witnessing, deeper relating, attunement, re-owning, becoming one with, and then through the re-owning, we can grow. There's post-traumatic learning. We become more whole. We become more mature. We grow up more individually, ancestrally. Ancestral trauma integration means ethical maturation, because often we didn't learn what our ancestors didn't learn. So we may be cognitively reflected, but we not embodily reflected, because in the body, the shadow is still active. And so I can say, listen, I don't want to get triggered anymore, but if I get triggered, I get triggered, if I want it or not. Like it will, the reaction in my body will show up. But if I re-own the original stress, the original process, and when we look at ancestral trauma, it's a bit different than biographical trauma. Ancestral trauma is either one conception, two conceptions, three conceptions away. So if my grandmother or my grandfather got hurt, there are two conceptions in between. That does something, that encodes the trauma in a different way in matter than my biographical trauma. So we need to learn to work with that a bit differently than with what happens in my own biography. And so that's why I'm saying that re-owning means I own the energy, and then once it's re-owned, it can change. And so witnessing is the beginning of that process of re-owning the past that was split off, that was shut unconscious, individually, ancestrally, collectively, and then things can change. Because if not, then it has that cycle that will come back at times and will recreate itself. And I think many of us, if you look at our lives, we know how these cycles look like, even if we see this in our personal lives. And we also might have had the experience when we really look at something deep enough that it really changed. And then from that time on, it's not that we can fall back into it. There is no back anymore. Integrated information has no past. That's what I said before. Integrated history is presence. Unintegrated history is the past. But if we integrate it, the past disappears. The past might still exist in history books, but not anymore as a reaction in my physical, emotional, mental experience. There's more freedom now to be really present with what is, and not to be overshadowed by fears, by shame, by guilt, by many other experiences that might come up when we get triggered.
Yeah, and that's so beautiful. And I want to add that that's also the importance and the power of doing this work in a group, because often there's something in our ancestry, in someone's ancestry, that hasn't been culturally included or witnessed. And so then we begin, like when someone brings that into the room, their ancestors, and the group can witness that, then something begins to integrate culturally, like that invisible or absent part of us begins to land and be integrated, and that's needed. That part is also needed, that I'm not just also sitting integrating all this myself, but a lot is a cultural piece, a cultural healing of the ancestry being more included in us. And that I've seen that be very powerful as well for all of us, and bringing the gifts of that ancestry into our collective as well. And the gift of the collective witnessing into that ancestry and maybe the collective context that ancestry comes from. And so that is also a very beautiful part of this work when we come together in community to do it.
Yes, and what you're just saying is also that in the course we will do smaller pieces of life work when people ask questions in the group, and then we can see this together, and then we see when something moves in one person, it ripples out into the community, and people can feel inner movements as well if they have a similar quality in themselves, and so it becomes like a dance between us. So it's what happens for one person is not isolated, but becomes like a shared learning, and that shared learning community is, I think, a powerful quality.
Exactly. And I did want to, there's a question that came in. Maybe you could speak briefly to this. I think it's powerful in our context today that Alo brought in, how are you able to approach ancestral healing when there's a mixed ancestry of different cultural streams that may historically or currently be in conflict with each other? And that, I'm just going to say that might seem like a burden, but also like then your ancestral healing code offers so much to the collective, right? Through that complexity of the healing. So just briefly, how might you look at that in this, in the course and in our work in a grounded way? What is that like here in this context?
Yeah, it's very similar. It's like on the one hand, it can be experienced as a burden because there's tension and external conflict in different communities or racial backgrounds or global communities or in between countries. Like might on the one hand generate an internal tension, of course, but I believe that also is how life tries to heal itself. Like these multiple streams of ancestry that come from different backgrounds through a conscious experience, like somebody who does inner work can turn that tension into more and more. And of course, it's not just happening in one say, I look a bit at this and it's gone. No, it's not like a wishful thinking. But if we can turn that tension into a creative process, and that, of course, turns the attention into creativity or my purpose, because we become everything that we heal, we become a natural remedy for. If we engage in client work or do groups or if we, whatever we do, it doesn't really matter. It's like we become a natural remedy, because with the integrated trauma has like sends out information into the social field of healing, that healing is possible. And so it enables healing in the social environment. And on the other hand, it, as you said, it ripples also back into the cultural tension and it adds something to the collective healing process. And again, it's not that if one person does that, the complete issue between cultures is being resolved. And everybody who does that work adds some possibilities that didn't exist before. It's also important. So these possibilities means new solutions, new innovations, new projects, new ways of looking at stuff. And so through that healing, we enable new cultural movements. And so the individual and the ecosystem are always interrelated. And if we heal something in ourselves, in our ancestral data, wherever we walk, just by sitting in the room, we transmit that healing. It becomes like, we become literally like a remedy. That's why, and for all our summits, we have interviewed so many hundreds of speakers, and many of them have exactly that story, so that their background and their inner work became also their purpose. So they turned their trauma into a psychoactive substance in themselves. So we actually become walking remedies. And many of the stories that we heard of many of the speakers is exactly that. And I think that's the beauty of, we were born And we have also the spiritual resource to really, that is alchemical. And when we activate it, and when we activate it in groups, this can be very, very powerful. And I think that's also why we are called to turn those tensions into purpose.
Beautiful. And I would say also when we're witnessing that, when we're witnessing someone else's healing process and deeply hosting it, then we also we're part of the cultural restoration in that as well, in our connections with our ancestries. So there's a richness happening in every dimension of that process when we do this work together. Mm-hmm. So thank you. Do you have more to say, Thomas?
Yeah, just I wanted to add to what you, because it's beautiful what you just said, is that we the separation that in our thinking we sometimes might put in between, me as an individual, my ancestors, and the culture, instead of, me as an individual, my ancestors, and culture are one spectrum of information and flow, and also stagnation. So sometimes we might feel more fixated and more locked in our individual experience. Sometimes we feel that there is stuff locked in our ancestors or in our cultural community, like in the cultural frozenness. But that there's also like a spectrum of flow, and that these things are not separate. We are made out of these different parts. And I think the more we experience flow, we experience also that these are not separate dimensions. They are all interdependent dimensions. So every individual healing fertilizes collective healing and vice versa. And that interdependence, I think, is deeply intelligent. And so we are all kind of interdependent beings. And I think there's a beauty to that. So we can impact all those dimensions all the time.
Yeah, wonderful. We're coming towards the close, and I do have some announcements for everybody, but just there's a question that keeps coming in that feels important just to address in like 1 minute is, and Elena and others are saying, can you speak to emotional safety during the course in terms of if there's past events or history of ours or others that feel kind of dark, and just briefly to speak to that sense of safety.
Yeah, first of all, as I said before, we wanna in the course also we will first look at allyship. So what's the collective safety of a group, or what's the right pacing? So we don't have to jump in, we don't have to do things that we don't want to do. We want to go step by step, and we can enable what we want to enable. And the second thing is so that certain exercises create some sort of collective safety in the group. And then we begin first with looking at what are our ancestral resources. We don't need to jump in what seems scary and dark for us. We want to look at where are our resources, and also where are our allies in our ancestry, and then learn to collaborate with that power, with the resilience, and then we open ourselves up. And I think the misunderstanding that often happens is that we are, some people think we are responsible for what our ancestors did. And it's not that we are responsible in the senses that we did that, but responsibility means we are able to respond to what our ancestors did. This is very, very different. Either we have a resonant relationship with that past, step by step, that's different from I'm responsible for what they did. So it's in me. But I can also not say it has nothing to do with me. I'm just free. No, I'm not just free. I can create a resonant relationship and have my own learning that matures my decisions to a different way, into a different way. Because some people say, I often say, like when you say, I will never be like my father, you will never leave the room. It's like I'm holding that wall. And when I hold that wall, I can't leave the room because now I'm holding that wall. I will not be. So the condition that I set also fixates me. But if I learn from my relationship, then I will make different choices today. So there will be more freedom in my life, not by denying my past, but by really examining my past. I will live a different life, and I will be a different example in the world. So we will, but that's a process, obviously. So we will need to step by step come closer to that.
Yeah, and I just also want to say I really deeply trust and have experienced in this community and with you, Thomas, that we really build the community of resource and what's needed before we start to open in a very careful way whatever else is coming. And that emotional safety is also being able to have support when you need it. So, like if something comes up emotionally, that I have, that I can go through that and ground again. And that there's a lot of beautiful energy and resource that comes through connecting first with the ancestry that is supportive, or with others and with each other in the group. So there's a lot of safety in that process, that we don't just jump right in, as you said, Thomas. So I'm going to just thank you so much, Thomas. It's so exciting. I wish we had even more time. And that's why we have this course coming up where we get to bring more questions and more learning. There's so much more to unpack and go through together here. So thank you so much for this. And I'm just going to have some announcements for us. But thanks, Thomas, for answering these questions, sharing with us. And yeah. So I'm going to just, invite you here with us to join in this upcoming 5-month live intensive on the Ancestral Healing Code, which begins on November 17th. And we'll get to take a deeper dive into healing intergenerational trauma, connecting with future descendants. We will not be offering this deep dive into this topic for some years, because this is our time to jump into it right now. And so if you're interested, please do join us for this fall intensive to go deeper in what we've been exploring today. When you enroll, you'll receive access to 10 live sessions, 8 live integration sessions with breakout groups, and Thomas's foundational teachings on collective trauma as well. And additionally, we're really thrilled to have these guest speakers joining us for intergenerational dialogues. Gabor Mate with son Daniel Mate, Vanessa Andreotti and daughter Giovanna Andreotti, Rick Hansen with his son Boris Hansen, and we'll also be joined by Serene Thin Elk and Ia Afo on ancestral healing. So it's a great companionship here. And enrollment is open for a limited time. So if you feel called to deepen into ancestral healing and expand your work with clients also in this realm, if you happen to work with people, we invite you to join us. And to get all the information, you can visit the website ancestralhealingcode.com. And when you register in the next few days, you will receive a discount on the course tuition, and you can pay in full or you can choose the payment plan. And we do understand that it's not always possible to join the live online sessions, or you might want to revisit the content, which is great. So the sessions are all recorded and they're posted for downloadable lifetime access. And again, you can join us by registering on the website ancestralhealingcode.com for only a few more days, because we'll start the course on Sunday, November 17th, and it will continue through April of next year. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us and being part of this unfolding today. And we really look forward to being with you and seeing you in the Ancestral Healing Code course. Bye for now.